You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. We have opened up the hotel for this special budget edition of Hotel Pacifico. Mike and Geoff, I hope you were able to get over to Victoria today, safe and sound. You both made it?
I came last night. Well, Jeff's very prepared. He's very proactive. He got over here the night before. I
Some
think I
different
showed up at the float.
styles.
I show up at the float plane with the low cloud cover. So I was very nervous waiting for the flight to be cleared, but managed to break into the lockup after it had closed, and I demanded to be given entry because I am with Hotel Pacifico.
I love that name carries that cloud.
We could not be denied, and I even have the pass to show it here. Hotel Pacifico.
Nice.
Mike McDonald. There you go. It's
nice.
official.
Well, we gotta give the breakdown for our listeners, and so I am keen to hear from both of you. I've been reading a lot of the coverage, and I'll set us up and say, one thing that strikes me and looking at the coverage, you can see there isn't one clear headline. This was a tough budget, I think, for the government. There just wasn't an easy way for them to kind of land a clear story out of this one. And a tough place where you're really probably managing a lot of folks who are disappointed, either disappointed because the thing they wanted wasn't funded, or disappointed because maybe they're concerned about the overall kind of growth of the debt ratio to GDP. So I'll start with you, Geoff. I mean, tell me, does that analysis seem fair? And who might be some of the folks you think out of today who might be disappointed by what wasn't in this budget?
Well, there's a lot of people who are always disappointed, but I think some people were happy that the government had a very difficult hand to play, and they decided to play it, I think, quite shrewdly because growth is down. They're coming up to an election. They decided to make it a very strong defensive budget, in my view, facing a divided opposition, and they're a strong position in the polls. They wound up with something they could say to everybody. They made the core values decision not to make cuts in the face of declining revenues. So there's a deficit there, but Finance Minister Katrine Conroy very clear that she was not prepared to tolerate a deficit in services when British Columbians are facing so many financial pressures. So in the debates ahead, you will see demands for relief on energy pricing, and there is a bonus for people, a reduction for everybody on their electricity this year. There's a family bonus one time, which I think between the two of them will add up to more than $1,000 for most families, especially in the lower income brackets. So this is direct action on affordability and an enormous discussion about housing. Some more assistance for first-time home buyers, a bit more protection for renters, and a lot of discussion, of course, about the huge investments they're making in rental housing for middle-income families, a program that's been rolling out for a number of weeks now. So they are in a good position going into the election to respond to the attacks they're likely to get. And what I understand opposition leader Kevin Falcon is doing is denouncing it as the craziest spending budget he's ever seen, reckless beyond measure. And I don't think the voters actually care about that if they feel their services are being protected. There's a huge lift there for healthcare, but the government did the best job it could on fiscal management by keeping it flat for all the other ministries. And I think that's a calculated risk. A larger deficit might have meant some more lift for other ministries, but it's very flat or even down for a lot of the line ministries. So that's it in a nutshell.
Geoff, I didn't notice that there was a charitable tax credit in the budget for your analysis for the government.
Okay, Mike.
No, this is not a registered charity, Mike. My advice is free, as you know.
Okay,
so you get what you pay for.
It's worth what you pay for it.
There's some numbers to back up. There's some numbers to back up what Geoff's saying, right? In the sense that the new spending was, I think, just shy of 7 billion, so 6.9 or something, right? And then the deficit itself is 7.9, right? So they really were in a position that they were probably going to be in the red. Know how we love talking about the red ink. They were going to be in the red regardless. And it was
the unsuspecting good people of Victoria who are outside my window here going about their daily business in the sunshine are completely unaware of the tsunami of red ink that is about to wash up on their shores. There is the red ink is taller than David Eby himself. Let me tell you.
Well, that's the question, Mike. So let me put this
doesn't
in
matter
to you. Yeah. Doesn't matter. No. I mean, it doesn't matter, but Well, it does, because I do think in the sense that folks do take this as a sort of it's a very easy to understand number and how you appreciate sort of the fiscal management in the government. And I think I want to put it to you in a slightly more nuanced way and say, is this the right amount of red ink, right? Like where, appreciating they probably were going to have to be in the red given the economic conditions. I mean, should they have diminished that more? And in the spending they did do, were those the right things?
Well, we've talked a lot on the show about when there's too much black ink,
Yes.
and now there's too much red ink.
Yeah.
I thought Les Lane had a really good question in the lockup. He just put it to the minister and said, 2 years ago when you forecasted what the deficit would be this year, or when the government did, they forecast a $3 billion deficit for this year. And now it's 8. So what's changed? Now, the minister had a very direct response to it. She said, well, we could have raised taxes, we could have cut spending, and we chose not to do that. We decided to just borrow. And that is exactly what they've done. And to Jeff's point, I agree that it does strike me as a bit of a defensive budget. It's a bit like, let's just calm the waters, make sure we're spending where we got to spend. And some of the interests out there that could get a little uppity about it did get a few things as well, like business. I'll get into that. But I don't feel like there's a great propelling vision behind the budget. And as some wag in the back room of the lockup said to me, if EB was 5 points down, this budget would look very different.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
EB is not 5 points down. He's about 20 points up. And so I think it's cautious from a political point of view. We can debate the economics. We can debate the fiscal merits of it. From a political basis, I believe they think this is a safe, a safe approach. And there's always a little danger, I think, when you're played too safe too. I think,
But
you don't want to be a sitting
opposition
duck.
attack is likely to be pretty incoherent because on the one hand, they want more help on affordability for people because they got to say something about people and not just talk about the bond raters and so forth. On the other hand, they want cuts, but no, they won't say what cuts they want. And they want their hospital open next week and so on and so forth. So if you look at the capital spending on the budget, there's a lot there for the average voter who wants to see if the government passes a head nod test on a number of fronts.
Do oppositions need to be coherent?
It's helpful. I mean, I
Ideally.
think it's helpful.
I mean,
It's
I never felt you were particularly coherent when you were in opposition,
Oh,
Jeff.
man.
Oh,
Boy.
this is getting
Boy, he misses
gloves are off.
he's held
We were
late
busy
for the-
governing.
late
You
for
guys
the
were
plane
so
and it ruins his
unreasonable.
mood all day.
So unreasonable.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Are you
But
saying this
you-
because BC United is so coherent right now, Mike? Like, is this
Well,
why
I'm
you-
just saying, I do think opposition has more license to
Yeah,
to,
but
Yes.
to finish my
to not have to-
compelling and incisive point,
Yes.
Mike,
yes.
if you see a school opening in your neighborhood, you think education is probably getting spending. If you see a hospital
Yeah.
going up, you think probably healthcare is going to be okay. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
both of those happening.
I know that's tough though, eh? Like, so they had the one school in Victoria I saw, and then the really direct question about Olympic
And-
Village sounds like that's coming.
And a big Amazon order of Lego has been sent to Surrey to build modular schools. The minister went
how
on
that
about
gets
that.
built. Insightful.
It's apparently Olympic Village is going to get a school because they
Mhm.
they
They-
telegraph that. But
Yeah.
for Surrey, it's just more little building blocks.
I mean, that's not a lot of
Um,
schools though in an election year, right? Like, you got to sprinkle those around.
Well,
Those are-
I mean,
a lot of schools there.
So,
Yeah.
so on the capital side, let me dive into that for a second. There was a big increase in capital spending, and when you unpack that, it's on important stuff like hospitals, lots of hospital stuff, St. Paul's, Burnaby,
Terrace.
Cowichan. Yeah,
How long
lots
have
of,
we got? There's
usually
quite a
is.
list.
There
Let me get
usually
my
is a
list.
yeah, there usually is a lot of hospital stuff. There's a lot of transportation stuff.
Mhm.
Stephen
Really
Guilbeault,
good
please
on
close
transportation.
your ears, Stephen Guilbeault. There's a
know.
lot, actually quite a
Interesting.
bit on roads there.
Yeah.
SkyTrain is in there. So Langley and Broadway. So, those are projects most voters would agree with, healthcare, roads, what's not to like.
Mhm.
My question would be, and this is a Von Palmer point that was raised, was like, geez, some of the costing of these capital projects a couple years ago is now like 60% higher. What's happened? And there is huge cost escalation on the capital side. So I'm concerned as a taxpayer that these capital the capital envelope is going up, but we're not necessarily getting more for it. It's same project, just more money. So from a governing point of view, I would like to see more focus and, a greater sense of urgency and alarm about the spiraling costs of these capital projects. I just don't think, I'm not saying this is literally happening, but throwing your hands up in the air and saying escalating labor costs is enough. Like, what are we going to do about it?
Well,
That's
it's like,
a
I
big
checked
problem.
into the hotel and discovered it was full, but it's actually the third empty because they can't get staff for a bunch of the
Yeah.
rooms. It is a real problem. I don't think there's been too much added in to the capital plan. These are all commitments that were made, and it'll be hard for anybody to stand up and say, sure, value engineering, but let's not do the Cowichan Hospital, or never mind, Mills Memorial can stay the way it is for a while longer. That's not going to happen.
Mm.
And the bottom line is on this whole debt question, our interest bite, while it's rising, yes, is still a fraction of what it is in Ontario and Quebec or Canada as a whole. And that's the government's key defense on that front for people who are paying attention to the fiscal argument. We still
You're
have a
welcome.
very healthy situation. I know I heard naysayers and doomsayers
Yeah.
wondering if we would get a downgrade. It'll be interesting to see, because if a downgrade happens to BC, then it'll happen in a lot of places.
I moved to BC 4 years ago from Ontario, and one of the things I've come to appreciate is all the small ways we do things differently here. The way us locals show that we're local, that we are of BC. Some things are obvious, like the way we embrace rain gear and how grown men and women wear adult-sized splash pants to the office. It rains here all the time, but we don't complain about the weather. We complain about ferry delays and the lineups at Seventh Heaven. Sometimes it's more subtle, more values-based, like how we embrace mountain views, but not always the advice of dentists to put fluoride in the drinking water. And milk comes in a plastic jug or carton, not a plastic bag. That's to Ontario, like the Maple Leafs and Drake. From the very beginning, Hotel Pacifico's presenting sponsor, TELUS, has been of and for BC. 20 years ago, their first office in the Brian Canfield Centre in Burnaby was affectionately known as the Boot, an obvious reference to a Blundstone, and TELUS has stayed true to their BC roots and commitment to community ever since. It shows up in things like the $18.5 billion investments in network infrastructure, operations, and spectrum TELUS has committed across BC over just the next 3 years. After years of supporting reforestation efforts, TELUS just planted their 1 millionth tree. That's a total equivalent of 20,000 acres of forest, or an area 20 times the size of Vancouver's Stanley Park. When British Columbians partner with TELUS, that is an investment that comes back to our communities through jobs, infrastructure, community giving, and government revenue. When TELUS wins, BC wins, because we're all in this together. Even Drake. Maybe we should send him some splash pants.
I'm the first person to ask like an interjurisdictional comparison. I mean, even on Mike's point about the cost of capital projects, I was sort of wondering, like, okay, what are other provinces and what are the feds doing in terms of what their estimates, how much their estimates are going up? Because I suspect it might be consistent. Anyway, my point is, though, I find with voters, I think that does not work. That is a policy wonk thing. The voters don't care if it hurts. It hurts.
It hurts later when you can't afford to do things because the cost of capital, of running these capital projects went way up. And BC has done a pretty good job managing capital projects over the years. Partnerships BC, which is now basically morphed into TI Corp, there's a lot of expertise there. I know it's hard, but that's one where I would just be pulling out all the stops to try to do what it takes to get more out of the capital spend that they're getting.
Oh, fair enough. But the other infrastructure debate that was preceding the budget was, well, LNG Canada 2 is finishing phase 1, Site C is finishing. There's going to be some other stuff winding up. Where we're going to have enough to take up the slack? And the answer is yes. And that will include, it looks like, private sector investment in the Northwest, because the government signaled repeatedly it was very committed to that kind of development by a number of measures. One is electrification of the Northwest, which is something that's been talked about for a long time, needed to reduce emissions for gas projects. They also committed 5 years times $50 million, $250 million, to commit communities in the Northwest alignment to help them with their municipal infrastructure costs. So if there wasn't any more construction going to happen, I don't think they would be committing $250 million to them. And they also committed to provide backup to First Nations wanting to take equity positions in energy projects. And
that's a big one.
The three together are a powerful
Yeah.
signal of where the government thinks revenue will come from in the future. It's going to continue to come, as it has this year, from oil and gas, or from gas royalties, basically. And another pressure in the budget, which is an interesting thing to me about how the debate on climate has changed, was hundreds of millions of dollars in various places of additional spending for climate mitigation, for firefighting, they're just building in the realities that we're now facing on those fronts. And those are cost pressures that everybody would have, and there's just no way you can cut them. I mean, this budget is tight and austere in certain ways because it's flat for all of the other ministries except education. The forecast allowance disappeared, and they're going to go to contingencies instead. And the finance minister, that was always part of the mix, but the forecast allowance was kind of a contingency for the contingencies. They are not going to do that because they feel they need the flexibility to go to contingency for things like climate issues and other emergencies, which we've been having on a regrettably frequent basis.
Yeah.
So there were some interesting sub themes to the conversation today.
Well, there's a bit of a political advantage of having a larger contingency too. I did notice in some of the line by line items spent by ministry, there are some surges this year, like education, for instance. I don't quite understand the education budget where it went up 800 million, which was about 10%. And then the next 2 years are flat. And so there's a few examples where the second and third year of the 3-year plan are flat. I'm thinking, like, how's that going to play out? I don't understand that part of it.
And on that point, Mike, I met stakeholders from the second post-secondary sector, education sector. Nobody knows what the consequences are going to be of the federal decision to cap international students, but it's varying a lot from place to place. So Langara, which has always had a high share of international students, is very anxious. So is Simon Fraser. BCIT recruits much more from local population, so they're not so worried.
Yeah. So I went into the electronic copy of the budget and did a few Command F searches to see, looking for certain words. I did not see the word fentanyl. I did not see the word opioid. I did see addiction.
Yeah.
But
there
I'm
was
surprised.
70 million on mental health and addictions.
I'm surprised with the number of deaths in the fentanyl crisis. There was no call out to that in the budget specifically for law enforcement or drug treatment specifically. So one could argue that was addressed through some of the language around addiction recovery, which there was some stuff in there. I wouldn't say there was it did not feel like we are at war over fentanyl in terms of what I read in the budget, but there was some stuff there. Another thing, just a noting, caught my eye, buried in the details, was a reference to revenues to be received from the Trans Mountain pipeline. And it didn't specify a number, but it's acknowledging that with the Trans Mountain coming on stream in the next year, there is money to be received to the public purse from Trans Mountain. And that is tracks back 10 years to Christy Clark and the 5 conditions, when she said, I'll only consider oil pipelines if there's something in it for BC. And that's partly what flows out of that, literally. So so a little bit, even though there's opposition, I would say actually a majority of people support the Trans Mountain Pipeline according to the polls, but of those that strongly object to it, they can comfort themselves knowing that there is.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Trans Mountain.
Well,
because
go ahead.
It partly answers your question, Kate, about what's happening in other projects. There's a federally managed infrastructure project that was in the private sector for quite a while, and it's like threefold its original cost. So it's a very, very big problem. I don't disagree with Mike. We should try to manage it down, but there's only so much you can do.
Right. Well, and these are projections, obviously. So they come from a few places. Well, I'm curious for both of you, like looking at this, realistically, what do we see cutting through? What is going to be the story of this budget? Is this going to punch through to the voters who might, probably aren't paying that much attention yet, but who might, is there anything that's going to stay on their brains when they start turning their heads to voting in a few months?
Well, I think it's hard because there's no real huge overarching theme here. It's a bit like nailing Jello, and the government is at risk if something does take off that they haven't framed. If you package up rising debt, sluggish economic growth, no real showpiece affordability item in the budget, I think there could be some vulnerability there, that there's just a bit of a malaise feeling. I don't want to oversell that. I think that relies on opposition to successfully prosecute it, and that remains to be seen. But to me, there's a bit of a vacuum there. On the like, there
Can
it's
I?
just the economy's just kind of sitting there, not doing much. The spending's up, the debt's
Yeah.
up. I mean, you go back over the years, there were times when governments went through that, and it didn't work out very well for them. I think people want to feel like they're going in a positive direction, even if tough times are ahead, that there's a plan to deal with it. And there's no forecast for a balanced budget. Like even if that's not the be all end all, but
Yeah.
the debt curve just is going up.
Yeah.
And so what is the plan? Is it just going to be structural deficit forever? 5 cents on the dollar for debt today, no big deal. But at
Well, I
Right.
what
think
point,
there's a
But how?
when
danger.
do we start caring? 10, 15, 20?
Well, sure, we do start caring, and and I think it's important to point out that the debt to GDP ratio is like in the last couple of years, 15% to 27.5%. Like that's a steep. We'll get to that point. But I was actually going to say something, and I feel like this might feel different for me than for the two of you, but something that I could see sticking in some minds is the IVF promise, right? Like I do
Mhm.
think it's not a big thing, but there's a segment of voters who are really important and live to them. And I'm going to
Yeah.
say, well, people will talk about it being mostly women, but I think it'll be women and their partners of a certain age who
Yeah.
are struggling
Yeah.
to afford homes, right? Like I think that is the kind of thing that sticks around. It's a talker, and I think that's a success in that sense.
I agree with
Sorry,
that.
Geoff. Yeah, yeah.
It was 11:52 p.m. on January 12th, 2024, when I arrived in Vancouver after a week of aloha. As I walked breezily out the arrivals door at YVR, a wall of frozen air punched me right in the face. Pro tip: check the forecast before you arrive from Hawaii in a t-shirt. While I was unprepared for this wintry cold blast, our sponsor, Fortis BC, was working overtime to ensure BC residents were not left in the cold. On that day, Fortis BC delivered twice the energy of BC's electricity system, and at 21,763 megawatts, showed us all how much we rely on diversified energy pathways. The thing is, gas customers like you and me have invested billions of dollars over the years into building the infrastructure that delivers gas to our homes and businesses across BC. That paid-for infrastructure allows gas to reach us reliably, safely, and affordably, like when that cold snap caused me to snap at YVR. Why did I leave my coat in my suitcase anyway? There'll be another January 12th, hopefully not too soon, and Fortis BC will be there for us with a diversified approach that builds on the strengths of our gas and electricity delivery systems and helps us meet provincial emissions reduction targets towards a clean energy transition. Hotel Pacifico may be heated by its own hot air, but Fortis BC is there when we need it. Energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
I think that we lose sight of the fact we're in a different period than we were when we used to have these debt to GDP arguments. I mean, we are not now just coming off a big, long boom like we were just before COVID. We just had a shellacking financially for 2 or 3 years in a row with completely unprecedented changes, some of which were very welcome. I mean, a year ago at this time, the government had just shed billions of dollars of end of year spending. So during the pandemic, there was a point at which I think the government was forecasting 9 years of deficits, and nobody was arguing. Nobody could be sure when finances would come back into scope. So part of the difficulty is, I think, is if you want to, and I always like big vision pieces as much as Mike, I think, but is this what people are really looking for right now? And I don't know the answer, but if they feel generally satisfied, and the polls suggest they do, that this is a government that has steered them through some pretty choppy waters, and they're going to get a bit of a break on their energy costs, they're going to get a bit of a break on some of their other direct costs. They're going to continue to receive free contraception, the IVF thing. They're going to see more support in the healthcare budget for seniors who don't want to go into long-term care but would like to stay at home. That may be what is really going to hit the mood properly, more than some large throw towards some great new vision. Because right now, I think people are going, I'd like some security and some strength in the government. I don't want to see a lot of experimentation and risk. So I think the challenge for the opposition is to make this fiscal argument into something meaningful for people in their daily lives. Because you can tell me all you want that our debt to GDP ratio is wrong, but if I'm getting a bit of help on my energy costs, that will trump that discussion.
Well, I think the opposition, one tack they could take is tell voters that the government's no longer wearing the comfortable cardigan sweater of John Horgan, and is now wearing the tie-dye T-shirt of David Eby.
It's not tie-dyed, it's a white starched shirt
It's
with no tie. I mean,
no, but I think
this guy sleeps in a suit, I'm sure of it.
No, I mean, this is the interesting thing of it. I think Mike is bang on. I do think this creates, because it was just such different economic conditions under the Horgan government. I don't think it's a big difference in how Horgan or Eby view the deficit, but it could become a bit of a contrast, and maybe I think it remains to be seen, but maybe some of that John Horgan glow does kind of shake off Eby over time. We'll be watching it to see it, guess. But I want to thank you, Geoff and Mike, for making the time today to do this post-budget analysis. It was actually really fun to kind of tuck into this one, and I hope listeners, you can get a helpful, quick digest from us. And I hope if you saw Geoff and Mike in the lockup, you did say hi. So
Can I sneak in a point, Kate? Just
you
under the
have
wire,
30 seconds.
just to be fair, I should be a little bit fair. If people do have time to look at the budget, there are a lot of morsels in there. And, one thing I think the government has done did go and address some stakeholder needs, and that helps neutralize the politics when people are heard and they get their stuff dealt with. Like small business companies under $1 million in payroll, they get a break on the what's it, Geoff, the EHT, the health transfer thingamajiggy, the MSP replacement tax. So for small businesses, that's meaningful for small payrolls, right? And the Board of Trade worked hard on that and got some mitigation on what they were looking for. And there's other examples too. So it's a mixed bag, but I thought it's not like there wasn't any thought or political strategy or legitimate government outreach in it. There was a lot. So it's
just
on that
tough
point,
circumstances.
the Premier personally, and I would normally be the finance minister, is going to the Board of Trade tomorrow for a big gathering to talk about it. So he's owning the budget personally, and it's very clearly part of his political manifesto for the coming year.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you both for your ending codexes there. And thank you, presenting sponsor TELUS. Thank you, Fortis BC. We'll see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.